this is really what caused that banking crisis to occur. And so it's important for us to understand that in order to understand that banking crisis. What happens to a mortgage after it closes? And this is something that a lot of people have no idea what happens to a mortgage after it closes. And so this is really what caused that banking crisis to occur. And so it's important for us to understand that in order to understand that banking crisis. Now, I'm going to admit that I'm going to oversimplify things just a little bit because this business that Gary's in is a very complicated business. And we're going to oversimplify it just a little bit in order to be able to have a good discussion about it. So we're going to categorize all of the mortgage lenders out there into one of three different categories: a mortgage banker, a mortgage lender, or a mortgage broker. And the banker are what you would think of as the big bank mortgage lenders. Those big banks that have money to lend to people. And where do the big banks get their money to lend? Anyone know where they get the money from?
Our deposits.
From us. Okay, we have our money at Wells Fargo, or some people do, and so there's all sorts of rules about how much of those deposits they're allowed to use or not. There's all these ratios and rules that they have to maintain. But yeah, they're using our deposits. Now, what's going to happen is that they're eventually going to run out. There's only so much. So keep that in mind as we go now to the mortgage lender. This is what Carrie is. And we're going to call it ABC Mortgage. And where does the mortgage lender get their money from?
Investors.
Yeah, they have investor relationships, or they have what's called a warehouse line, and then sometimes both. And so let me just use the example of somebody who has a warehouse line. Let's say that Carrie has a $1 million warehouse line. You come through the door and you ask to borrow $100,000. She finds you worthy. She lends you the $100,000. 9 more people come through the door, and each wanting $100,000. She writes those total of 10 loans. Her warehouse line now is totally used up, and so she can't write any more loans. So you can see that that can also run out. And even the investors, there's only so much money there to invest with, and so that also could run out. All right, so just keep that in mind as we talk about. Now the third one is a mortgage broker, and a mortgage broker, they don't have any money. They just have the relationship between the client and them, and who does have the money. And so the brokers actually broker the deal back to either a mortgage banker or a mortgage lender. Now, as I mentioned, eventually the banker or the mortgage lender the money is going to run out. And so how has the industry solved for that? They actually sell these mortgages to a wholesaler. So the wholesaler buys them, and the wholesaler pays above the face value of the loan to these lenders. And so this is one of the ways that the lenders can make money on the loan. Now, what does the wholesaler do with it? A wholesaler means they're going to
sell it to somebody else.
Yeah, they bundle it together and they sell it. Does anyone know who they sell it to?
Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac.
Yes, they sell it to Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, there's some others. Who in the world is Fannie? Who is she? Who is Freddie? What are these companies? Are these government or private? So they used to be totally private, and then when this lending crisis happened, the government said, we need to come in and save the day. And so they became like a public-private relationship. And because of the just sheer amount of the volume of dollars we're talking about here, it really does function better with the backing of the U.S. government. And so Fannie and Freddie purchase these loans, and tons of them from all sorts of different wholesalers. And then what do Fannie and Freddie do with them? They actually do something that's called securitization. And securitization means that they take a bunch of mortgages and they mix them together in a certain mixture and they create a security. Or you may have heard the term mortgage-backed security. Anybody ever heard that term before? Yeah, so this is the way that those mortgage-backed securities get created. And you'll see here that on the diagram I've shown that they'll mix what's called A, B, and C paper together to create different kinds of mortgage-backed securities. So you got the highest class A, then lower B, and the next down there is C. Why would they ever mix any C paper in with A paper? Oh, so they're just hiding the sins of the C's with the A's? Let's say that you come to me and you say, I need $100,000, and I lend you $100,000. And let's say that my interest rate is 10% annually. And so you're paying me 10% annually. That means that as long as she's paying me, I'm making a 10% yield on my money. But then bad things happen to you that can happen to good people, and you go belly up. But what happens when she goes belly up? Now what's my return? 0. Well, let's say instead Gia comes to me and she says she wants $100,000, you want $100,000, and I go to my friend Teresa and I say, Teresa, why don't we each lend them 50? They each get their 100,000, we each got 50 into them, and then poor Tara still goes the one that goes belly up. Now what's the return on our money? 5%. So instead of going from 10 to 0, we went from 10 to 5%. Now, if we extrapolate that out, and I have 10 people come to me wanting $100,000, and I go to 9 of my friends, and I say, let's each give them $10,000 each. They each get their $100,000 total that they need to buy the house. She still goes belly up, unfortunately. What's the return to the investors now? 9%. So 9%. So that right there is securitization. And so what they do is they mix the A, B, and the C paper in a way to create a certain risk-return profile. Now this is going to become really important later. You're going to see how this got really jacked up and caused a massive mortgage crisis. Now that risk-return profile, why does mixing C paper change the average? These ones tend to have a higher interest rate. These ones tend to have a lower interest rate because the general rule of thumb is that the higher the interest, the higher the risk, right? So when you get paid for taking risk, that's how it works in the financial world. He who takes the risk makes the return. And so they can do some securities that have a higher percentage of A it's a little bit of a lower return, but it's more stable. Or they can mix some in that have a higher percentage of C that might be less stable, but also might be a higher interest rate return. Everyone understanding securitization?